Elias Thorne did not move to the secluded community of Avalon Heights for the neighbors. He moved there for the silence, for the oppressive, expensive peace that came with manicured lawns and homes separated by enough acreage to ensure privacy. The crowning jewel of his property was the pool, a dark, angular design of slate and glass, a 12-foot deep aquatic sanctuary he had christened Elysium. It was his reward, his retreat from the hyper-competitive world of quantum finance, a place where the only sound should be the distant, benign chirping of crickets. But the silence died 6 months after the Rowlands moved in next door. The Rowlands, Gary, a loud, affable man with a perpetual tan and an even more perpetual sense of entitlement, and his wife, Brenda, who regarded the world through the narrow lens of social climbing, had 3 children. 3 little agents of chaos who viewed the 6-foot-tall cedar fence separating the 2 properties not as a barrier, but as a minor hurdle to be surmounted in the pursuit of unauthorized fun. The first time it happened, Elias was working late in his home office, a space soundproofed against everything but the most aggressive noise. He heard a high-pitched shriek, followed by a loud, echoing splash. He checked his security monitors. There they were, 13-year-old Toby Rowland, shirtless, dripping pool water all over Elias's new slate patio, hauling his younger sister, 8-year-old Lily, out of the deep end. Elias walked out, his expression carefully blank. The air was heavy with the smell of chlorine and blooming night jasmine. "Toby," Elias said, his voice calm, but with a cutting edge of finality that was usually reserved for boardroom negotiations. "You need to leave, now." Toby, whose eyes were still wide with adrenaline, stammered, "Well, we just thought no one was home, Mr. Thorne." Lily, however, was defiant. "It's hot! Your pool is way better than ours. It's too shallow." "This is private property," Elias stated, not addressing the child, but looking directly at the cedar fence where the top plank had been clearly bent inward. "If you step foot on it again, I will call the police." This was his first mistake. An empty threat. He was a man of logic and order, not neighborly conflict. He just wanted the problem to go away. Toby dragged Lily back to their side, the dripping pair scrambling over the fence with reckless speed. The next day, Gary Rowland was at his door, holding a 6-pack of craft beer and flashing a smile that was entirely too wide. "Elias, my man, listen. About last night," Gary started, thrusting the beer forward. "Kids being kids, right?" Toby said he was sorry. "We had a little talk. Brenda and I are so sorry they disturbed you." Elias didn't take the beer. "The disturbance isn't the issue, Gary. The issue is trespass. It's illegal and it's dangerous. My pool deck is locked. There is no access." Gary chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. Yeah, I get it. We just need a ladder for our side, see? Our pool is under maintenance, cracked tile, whole 9 yards. Look, how about this? I'll throw you $50 every time they use it, just for the hassle. No police, right? Just a little neighborly understanding." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Gary wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was negotiating access. He saw Elias's pool as a shared resource, a communal amenity. "No, Gary. The answer is no. You need to repair your pool. Until then, you need to tell your children to stay off my property." Gary's smile finally slipped. A shadow of annoyance crossed his face. "Come on, Elias, don't be that guy. We're neighbors. We've all got to live here. It's one pool." "It's my pool," Elias corrected, his voice hardening. "And if I see your kids in it again, I will prosecute. Consider this the final warning." The conversation ended there, the hostility thick enough to choke on. Elias immediately spent a considerable sum hardening his perimeter. He installed 2 new high-definition thermal sensing cameras focused entirely on the pool area and the fence line. He replaced the compromised cedar plank with a 7-foot section of high-grade aluminum fencing, topped with subtle, sharp deterrents. Finally, he installed a magnetic locking system on the gates that required a fingerprint scan and registered every entry attempt. For 3 quiet, blissful weeks, peace reigned. Elias began to relax, convinced his technological and monetary investment had won. He even swam a few late nights, enjoying the dark velvet water under the silent sky. Then came the Friday night. Elias was on a video call with a client in Tokyo when his phone buzzed. It was an alert from his security system. Access denied. Fence breach at Zone Alpha. He opened the live feed on his secondary monitor. The sight made his hands tremble with pure, unadulterated fury. The aluminum fence was still intact, but the Rowlands had found a new way. Gary, utilizing a scaffolding setup from a recent landscaping project, had draped a large, thick tarp over the deterrence, creating a smooth, temporary bridge. And they weren't just the kids this time. Gary and Brenda were in the pool, reclining on Elias's expensive, custom-made floating loungers, sipping drinks. Toby was performing cannonballs off the deep end, sending sheets of water crashing onto the slate. They were loud. They were deliberate. It was an act of open, malicious defiance, a declaration that Elias's rules and his property were irrelevant. Brenda looked directly into one of the thermal cameras and raised her glass in a toast. The gesture was a knife twist. Elias hung up on his client, his meticulous composure shattered. He strode to the back door but stopped, his hand hovering over the handle. He knew if he confronted them now, it would be a physical, ugly brawl, and he would lose the moral high ground. He needed a strategic victory. He needed leverage. He retreated to his study, sinking into his leather chair, watching the feed. His breathing was ragged. They hadn't just trespassed. They had desecrated his sanctuary. The Rowlands didn't respect warnings, laws, or even property lines. They respected consequence. He opened his laptop, pulling up the schematic of Elysium. The pool wasn't just a fiberglass basin. It was a complex system of automated pumps, chemical sensors, and custom-designed LED lighting rigs powered by an auxiliary solar array. It was also connected to the house's smart system, which he had built himself. He stared at the bright blue water on the screen, reflecting the mocking smiles of his neighbors. He realized he had been thinking defensively. He needed to think offensively. He needed a measure that wasn't a lock, a camera, or a verbal warning. He needed something that would make them not just stop trespassing, but actively fear the thought of ever approaching his property again. For 3 hours, Elias didn't move. The sounds of the Rowlands' illicit party a deafening soundtrack to his calculations. He didn't devise a fence. He didn't devise a siren. He designed the warning. When the Rowlands finally climbed back over their temporary tarp bridge, leaving behind wet towels and empty cans, a final insult, Elias was already in the garage, pulling out the custom-built, waterproof housing unit he'd designed for a failed drone project years ago. He picked up his phone and called his most trusted, most discreet contact, a man who specialized in industrial automation and highly experimental electronic countermeasures. "I need your help," Elias said, his voice now eerily calm. The rage transmuted into a cold, diamond-hard intent. "I need you to build me a custom system. It has to be immediate, irreversible, and entirely memorable." He paused, looking at the water. "Now eerily calm again. I want to make sure," Elias concluded, his voice a low, chilling whisper, "that the next time they dip a toe in that water, they remember every single rule they broke." The first action had been passive defense. The second was strategic offense. The consequences were about to become very, very real. The man Elias called Jax arrived 2 days later, not in a branded company van, but in a nondescript black pickup truck with no plates and windows so heavily tinted they seemed to absorb the light. Jax himself was a study in efficient anonymity, a lean man in his late 40s with wire-frame glasses, hands that moved with mechanical precision, and the unsettling habit of listening without ever shifting his gaze. He didn't offer a handshake. "Thorne," Jax clipped, stepping into the climate-controlled silence of Elias's garage, which now housed the waterproof drone housing unit and a schematic board covered in highly specialized wiring diagrams. "Your message was ambitious. You're asking for a bespoke solution to a social problem." Elias bypassed the pleasantries. "I'm asking for a technical solution to a breach of contract. They were warned. They escalated. This is the counter-escalation." He pointed to the drone housing, now stripped of its failed propulsion systems. "This is the chassis. I need 3 components integrated and deployed subsurface. The system must be triggered remotely via a specific sequence on my home network, and its effects must be instant and non-reversing for a minimum of 72 hours. Jax leaned in, studying the detailed circuit board Elias had laid out, a sophisticated logic controller built around the pool's existing chemical injection system and the high-output LED lighting grid. The logic is sound. The execution is complicated. What is the warning, exactly? Elias walked over to a sealed cooler containing two thick, opaque carboys labeled with only hazard symbols. It's a proprietary, non-toxic, non-irritant blend. Think of it as a pigment and a potent temporary scent agent. It leverages the pool's main circulation pump and the deep-end pressure equalization jet. The pigment, once mixed with the existing chlorine, will instantly flash the water to the shade of raw sewage. Simultaneously, the scent agent, which mimics industrial methane, will atomize into the air, creating a psychological effect. Jax raised an eyebrow, a rare flicker of emotion. An aesthetic and olfactory deterrent. Brutal. Effective but brutal. And the lighting? The high-output LEDs, the ones that are currently submerged, will flash rapidly in an irregular, strobing pattern. The combination is meant to turn Elysium into a repulsive, disorienting nightmare the second they break the surface tension. It doesn't physically harm them, but it ruins the water for everyone for days. It's costly for me, but it's a permanent lesson for them. Jax nodded slowly, calculating. You'll need a robust pressure sensor bypass and a dedicated communication relay to override the standard pump timer. If the system fails mid-injection, you'll have a toxic mix. He met Elias's gaze, the threat implicit, and a potential homicide charge. The system has 3 fail-safes, Jax, all built into the logic controller, Elias stated, pointing to a series of redundant relays. If the primary injection sequence does not complete within 6 seconds, the entire system dumps a massive counteragent neutralizing formula and shuts down. I want to frighten them, not hurt them. I am not a killer, Jax. I am an order of magnitude higher on the food chain, and I'm asserting dominance. Right. Dominance, Jax murmured, unconvinced but pragmatic. The fee has tripled, Thorne. This requires 3 full days of covert access to your pool house and the foundation beneath the deep end. And I want the first half paid in cryptocurrency now. No paper trail. The deal was struck with a quiet, mutual distrust. The next 3 days were a masterclass in covert engineering. Elias arranged for a landscaping company to erect a large privacy screening tent around the pool, citing urgent tile repairs and resurfacing. The Rowlands, predictably, were immediately suspicious. On the first morning, as Jax was drilling an access port through the heavy-gauge concrete leading from the pump room to the deep end, Gary Rowland appeared at the edge of the screen tent. Elias, what is going on here? Gary's voice boomed, projecting manufactured concern. Resurfacing? It looked perfectly fine to me on Friday night. Elias stepped out from behind the tent flap, shielded from the view of the machinery. He wore work clothes and carried a clipboard, playing the part of the harassed homeowner. It's a deep structural issue, Gary. The initial construction was flawed, Elias lied smoothly. It's a massive undertaking. The noise is going to be terrible. I actually wanted to apologize in advance, as it will likely go on for several days, possibly a week. A week? That's excessive, Gary said, his eyes narrowed, trying to peer past Elias. His entitlement was curdling into active surveillance. We were just hoping to cool off this weekend, you know. It's supposed to hit 100. You'll have to use your own pool, Gary, Elias said, a faint, cold smile touching his lips. Or perhaps the community center pool. Mine is out of commission for the foreseeable future, Gary huffed, realizing he wasn't getting anywhere. He retreated, but Elias saw him later that day on the Rowlands' second-story balcony, openly aiming a pair of expensive binoculars toward Elias's property. Elias felt a surge of satisfaction. The hunt was officially on. Inside the tent, the pressure was immense. Jax worked with tireless efficiency, soldering leads, running fiber optic cable through the underground conduits, and securing the custom injection manifold deep within the plumbing. The final step was mounting the waterproof housing unit, the heart of the warning, to the floor of the deep end, camouflaged perfectly against the slate tiles. On the third night, Jack sealed the final access panel, the only visible evidence of his work, a faint, almost invisible seam in the concrete floor of the pump house. "It's active." "Thorn," Jax announced, wiping his hands on a rag. "The logic controller is running the diagnostic loop. You send the execute command via the dedicated IP sequence. It overrides the chemical sensors, fires the high-pressure jets, and initiates the simultaneous release of the pigment and the odor agent. The lights go to strobe mode 200 milliseconds after injection begins." Elias opened his security app, which now featured a new unmarked icon that required a retinal scan to access. He tapped it. The screen flashed. "System armed. Standby mode 100%. What about the cleanup?" Elias asked, thinking ahead. "The counter agent in the fourth carboy will neutralize most of the pigment, but the scent is oil-based. It will cling to the liner and the air for days. You're looking at a full draining and repressurization, and the pigment will permanently stain the filter media," Jax warned. "A necessary cost," Elias agreed, transferring the final payment. Jax simply walked out, disappearing into the dark, leaving behind a silence more profound than before. Elias stood alone by his pool, the blue water shimmering under the security lights, deceptively inviting. His fingers hovered over the execute icon. It felt like holding a tactical nuclear weapon. It was terrifying and exhilarating. He didn't have long to wait. 20 minutes after Jax left, a familiar sound, the loud, rattling thump of a text alert, came from his phone. It wasn't the security system. It was a local community bulletin group that Brenda Rowland, in her relentless pursuit of social standing, used to broadcast her life. Brenda Rowland, so excited, hosting a huge end-of-summer bonfire and swim party this Saturday for the whole cul-de-sac. "Bring your own floats. Let's make some memories. Can't wait to celebrate." Elias looked at the message. The sheer arrogance of the assumption that they would host a neighborhood party, knowing their own pool was broken, and simply take over his, was breathtaking. They weren't just trespassing anymore. They were performing. He looked down at the pool. Elysium. Now it was a trap, a beautiful 12-foot-deep slate-and-glass trap waiting for its prey. Elias walked back into his study, the glow of the armed icon reflecting in his eyes. He sent one text message back to the group thread, keeping it short and cryptic. "Elias Thorne, you have been warned." The anticipation was a physical weight in his chest. Saturday night? The biggest audience they could muster. The stakes were no longer about a property line. They were about public humiliation, the destruction of Gary and Brenda's carefully constructed social image, and the ultimate unforgettable cost of entitlement. The warning was ready to debut. Saturday night arrived, a suffocating blanket of heat draped over Avalon Heights. Elias sat in his soundproofed study, the only light in the room emanating from the multi-screen security console. The temperature read 98 circa textva. It was the perfect night for a baptism of fire, or in this case, sewage. The Rowlands' party was a loud, vulgar affair. 30 people, the entire cul-de-sac, it seemed, milled about their small, tile-cracked patio. The air was thick with the scent of cheap charcoal and louder, cheaper laughter. But the magnetic pull of Elias's pristine, 12-foot-deep Elysium was palpable. All eyes, including Gary and Brenda's, kept flicking to the dark, silent expanse on the other side of the 7-foot fence. Elias monitored the Rowlands' preparations. They hadn't used the scaffold this time. That would have been too obvious for an audience. Instead, Gary had positioned a professional-grade inflatable slide, ostensibly for children, right next to the fence line. It was an elaborate, brazen act of subterfuge. At 9:47 a text, PM dollars, the moment arrived. Gary, holding a cheap plastic cup, clapped his hands loudly. "All right, everyone, let's beat this heat. Brenda and I have a surprise for you all. Our good friend Elias is letting us use his spectacular pool tonight. Head on over, kids, first." A few neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances, but Gary's confidence, or perhaps the oppressive heat and the free alcohol, swept aside any lingering doubts about propriety. Brenda opened a latch that Elias hadn't known existed. a small, cleverly disguised gate tucked into a shrub line that Gary must have installed during his own landscaping. The trespass was no longer just a crime. It was a public parade. The children streamed through first, shrieking with excitement, running directly toward the inflatable slide now pressed against the aluminum deterrents. Gary followed, beaming, carrying an enormous novelty pool float, a pink flamingo. Brenda, walking with the practiced, slow grace of a diva taking the stage, brought up the rear, stopping just long enough to lock the gate behind her. Elias's pulse was a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He zoomed in on the faces of the main offenders: Toby, Lily, Gary, Brenda. He watched them cross his manicured lawn, the physical violation of his space. Two men from the party, encouraged by Gary's lead, were the first to peel off their shirts and stand at the edge of Elysium, admiring the dark, inviting depth. "Clear water, man," one slurred. "Gary, you weren't kidding. This is paradise." Gary laughed, a loud, triumphant roar. "Told you! Thorne doesn't use it anyway. Dive in, gentlemen, the water's fine." As the two men began to lower themselves into the water, one stepping tentatively onto the submerged slate steps, the other executing a clumsy jump, Elias placed his thumb on the biometric scanner pad on his console. He watched Brenda dip her toe, a look of sublime victory on her face. "This is mine now," her expression screamed. His thumb pressed down. "Access granted. Execute." The logic controller fired the high-pressure jets instantly. The transformation was immediate, violent, and complete. The crystal blue water of Elysium didn't fade or cloud. It flashed. The proprietary pigment, hitting the heavy concentration of chlorine in the jets, instantly polymerized into a shocking, noxious color. The entire body of water, 12 feet, deep and 40 feet wide, turned the color of putrid, bubbling bile and raw industrial waste. Simultaneously, the subsurface speakers, integrated into the drain system, screamed to life, emitting a sound that was less of a tone and more of a vibrating metallic shriek that cut through the night air. The lights beneath the water, the high output, LEDs began to strobe at a nauseating, irregular frequency, turning the scene into a disorienting horror show. The men who had just entered the pool stumbled, submerged in the foul-colored liquid, unable to see or orient themselves in the blinding, flashing light. Then came the smell. The oil-based scent agent atomized on contact with the heated air above the water. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was a visceral, overpowering stench of decaying matter and industrial methane, instantly triggering the fight-or-flight response in every single trespasser. A chorus of gagging and choking erupted. The first man in the water scrambled onto the steps, covered head to toe in the revolting liquid, retching onto Elias's meticulously clean slate. The other man thrashed blindly in the deep end, trying to find the surface, illuminated by the violent strobes. Brenda, who had been dipping her foot, screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She slipped on the wet deck, falling backward and landing hard on her elbow. She scrambled back toward the fence, weeping, her elegant cocktail dress now spattered with the viscous, sickening fluid. Gary Rowland froze, the pink flamingo float dropping forgotten from his hand. His face, visible in the brief, violent flashes of the strobes, cycled through disbelief, horror, and incandescent rage. His party guests were scattering, jumping back over the little gate, pulling their terrified children with them. The noise of the panic was deafening. Elias sat motionless in his study, watching the cinematic wreckage of Gary's social standing unfold. He had achieved total victory. Gary, bypassing the screaming and retching chaos, rushed to the aluminum fence, his face contorted into a mask of pure violence. "Thorne, you sick son of a bitch! What did you do?" Gary shrieked, grabbing the aluminum railing and shaking it violently. Elias walked slowly to the sliding glass door and opened it just enough to hear, standing safely inside the threshold. The stench of the warning was powerful even from 40 feet away. "I warned you, Gary," Elias said, his voice level, calm, and devastatingly clear. "I told you the fence was locked. I told you this was private property. You chose to trespass, Gary. You chose to perform an illegal act in front of 30 witnesses. This is toxic waste. You poisoned us. I'm calling the police, Thorne." "You're going to jail for chemical assault," Gary screamed, spitting with fury. "It's a proprietary blend of organic vegetable dye and food-grade scent agent, Gary," Elias countered, pulling up the compliance documentation on his tablet. "Non-toxic, non-irritant, merely repulsive, and I have every single second of your public criminal trespass on record. The moment you stepped through that gate, you consented to my property's security measures." Gary was beyond reason. His pride, his status, and his party were dissolving into a sickening, stinking humiliation. He looked wildly around at the fleeing neighbors and the two men still gagging and dripping on the slate deck. His eyes landed on Elias's head, framed perfectly in the doorway. In a moment of absolute catastrophic rage, Gary lunged. He grabbed a heavy garden stone, a decorative rock he must have noticed earlier that week, and with a guttural roar of pure hatred, he hurled it. The stone sailed through the night air, aimed for Elias's head. Elias saw it coming and reflexively took one step back, out of the open doorway. The rock missed Elias entirely, but it didn't miss the sliding glass door. The expensive, reinforced. Glass exploded inward with a deafening crash, sending a spiderweb of cracks across the reinforced panel and showering the rug just inside the study with glittering shards. Elias didn't flinch. He looked down at the physical damage, the shattered piece of his sanctuary, and then back at Gary, who was panting, shoulders heaving, realizing the enormity of his desperate criminal act. Elias raised his tablet, the light illuminating his face, now devoid of emotion. He held it up, showing Gary the screen, which was running the security feed. "That, Gary," Elias said softly, letting the word hang in the stinking, chaotic air. "That is felony vandalism and attempted assault. Unlike your trespass, which is a misdemeanor, that has actual consequences." Elias stepped back fully into the broken study, pulling out his phone. He didn't call the police. He called his lawyer. "The time for warnings is over," he murmured, looking at the broken glass, a new level of cold resolve settling in. Now, the real consequences begin. The morning sun, usually a welcome golden feature of Elias's property, now shone brutally on the shattered reality of the previous night. The air, even 10 hours later, was thick with the faint, cloying, and utterly repulsive smell of the warning. The pool water, still the color of oxidized copper and sickly sweet sludge, looked less like a pool and more like an open septic reservoir. A jagged spiderweb of cracks defined the broken sliding glass door leading into Elias's study. Elias had been awake since 4 AM dollars, running the final phase of the warning system, the deployment of the counter agent. The neutralizing formula had mostly broken down the pigment, but the process was slow, churning the water into a muddy, unsettling brown. The expensive filtration system was already ruined, saturated with the stubborn, oily scent agent. This cleanup would cost him over $20,000, an amount he tallied without a flicker of remorse. It was the price of victory. At 8:30, text AM, his lawyer, Mr. Stern, arrived. Stern was an older man with a calm, precise manner and an air of quiet financial power. He surveyed the damage, the pool, the glass, and then sat down. "Reviewing the tablet containing the 3-hour video evidence. The rock throw is the key." "Elias," Stern said, tapping the screen where Gary Rowland's face was contorted in primal fury. "The intentional trespass is a given, but a minor civil matter. This, the felony vandalism and the clear attempt to strike you, which constitutes assault, changes everything. It turns this into a criminal matter and gives us immense leverage in the subsequent civil suit." "Gary is claiming I used toxic chemicals," Elias stated, leaning back, watching the Rowlands' yard through the window. Their side was silent, grim, Stern offered a cool, professional smile. "We already have the lab reports and the MSDS sheets you provided for the dye and the scent agent. It's all food grade or cosmetic grade. Morally abhorrent, perhaps, but legally sound. You were defending your property and responding to a clear and immediate threat of trespass that your neighbors had repeatedly ignored. You simply made the environment of the trespass unpleasant." Gary's reaction, however, was clearly criminal. Elias had his marching orders. "I want to press charges, Mr. Stern, all of them. I want a civil suit filed immediately for the cost of the door, the pool drainage and filtration system, the landscaping damage caused by the runoff, and a substantial sum for emotional distress and the repeated violation of my peace. Elias, we can secure a favorable settlement, a massive payout, a signed non-disclosure agreement, and a guarantee they move out within 6 months, Stern suggested. Ever the negotiator? No settlement, Elias said, his voice hard. I want him prosecuted, and I want them gone permanently, without the ability to use the money from any settlement to fund their next move nearby. I want to ruin them financially and socially to the point where Avalon Heights is toxic to them. This is not about money, Mr. Stern. This is about consequence. Stern nodded, his eyes showing a flicker of admiration for the cold calculus. As you wish. The police will arrive shortly to take your statement and collect the video evidence. They will proceed with the arrest based on the felony charge. Meanwhile, across the fence, the Rowlands were living their consequences. The stench was not receding. Gary was frantically scrubbing the deck with a high-pressure washer, while Brenda, her elbow heavily bandaged, sat miserably on a folding chair, attempting to manage the social fallout. She was typing furiously on the community group chat, attempting to spin the narrative. Brenda Rowland. Warning! Our neighbor, Elias Thorne, is mentally unstable. He poisoned his own pool with noxious chemicals and assaulted our guests. My husband, Gary, heroically tried to intervene and was nearly hurt. We are pursuing felony chemical assault charges. Her attempts were met with cold silence or outright hostility. The other neighbors had seen the chaos. They had smelled the odor. They had children who had fallen ill, and they knew Gary had smashed the glass. Brenda's desperate lie was collapsing under the weight of shared experience. Mrs. Chen, neighbor, the odor is horrific. My son's eyes are swollen. We saw Mr. Rowland throw a rock at Mr. Thorne's house. I have already contacted the HOA regarding the property damage on both sides. Mr. Davies, guest from the party. I was in the water. It was disgusting. Gary told us Mr. Thorne gave permission. My wife's dress is ruined. If this was a chemical attack, why is Mr. Thorne calling the police and not you? The social siege was complete. Brenda, seeing the conversation turn against her, threw her phone across the lawn in a fit of impotent fury. Gary, overhearing the conversation as he tried to drain the last of the vile water, finally broke. He sank onto his hands and knees, clutching his head. I'm going to jail, Brenda. I threw a rock, on video. It's a felony. He planned this. He knew I'd snap, Gary whispered, his voice cracking with panic. No, we call the police first. We say he put something in the pool after we were invited. Brenda spat, desperate for a foothold, but it was too late. At 10:45, text AM, a pristine black and white patrol car from the county sheriff's office pulled silently up to Elias's driveway. Elias met the two officers, provided his statement, and handed over the tablet containing the time-stamped, crystal-clear footage of the entire event, culminating in Gary's reckless throw. The officers were courteous and efficient. They finished their process and then drove slowly down Elias's driveway. But they didn't leave Avalon Heights. They pulled up directly in front of the Rowlands' house, the flashing blue light reflecting menacingly off the immaculate surface of Elias's broken glass door. The cul-de-sac, which had been pretending to be busy with their Sunday morning chores, stopped. Every single window of every house now framed a silent, judging observer. Gary Rowland was yanked to his feet by his wife, who whispered frantically, "Tell them you were defending yourself." Too late. The officers were already walking up the path. Gary was arrested swiftly and quietly. The officer read him his rights, his words amplified by the suburban silence. The sight of Gary, hands cuffed behind his back, his face pale and slack with shock, being led past the onlookers and into the back of the patrol car was the definitive end of the Rowlands' reign of entitlement. Brenda screamed his name, a raw, theatrical sound that echoed down the street. As the police car pulled away, taking Gary toward the county jail, Elias stepped out onto his broken patio, watching the scene from afar. The neighbors met his gaze. There was no sympathy, only a potent mixture of relief and fear. Relief that the Rowlands were finally facing consequences, and fear of the calculating, relentless man who had orchestrated their ruin. Elias had won the battle for his pool. But as he stared at the retreating car, he felt the first cold, sickening realization of what he had truly traded his peace for. A lifetime of hatred from the woman still screaming next door. The major turning point wasn't Gary's arrest. It was the arrival of the second unmarked car that had followed the police cruiser. An elegant silver sedan pulled up to the Rowlands' curb. A severe woman in a sharp business suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase stamped with the logo of a large, predatory financial institution. She ignored Brenda's hysteria, walked past her and directly to the Rowlands' mailbox, where she clipped a large, official envelope. The envelope was a notice of default and foreclosure. Elias realized with a jolt that his actions, the public shame, the criminal charges, and the impending civil suit had not just ruined their weekend. They had triggered a catastrophic financial clause in Gary's pre-existing leveraged investment portfolio. Elias's war hadn't just been against trespass. It had inadvertently destabilized Gary Rowland's entire fragile fiscal foundation.